Hello, I'm Andy Agafangelo. I'm carrying out this video interview of Andrew Kaye in my capacity as chair of the Secretariat Committee to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. I am also, however, the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to have this conversation with me today. As you know, the conversation is being video recorded. The video recording will be placed on the APPG's website and will raise awareness of it through social media. You're carrying out this conversation with me, Andrew, on the basis that you have already provided a written submission to the All-Party Parliamentary Group's Call for Evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. Could I invite you, first of all, please, Andrew, to tell us about yourself and outline just briefly to begin with how you came to interact with the Financial Conduct Authority. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, and good morning. My name's Andrew Kaye. I'm the CEO of Transpact.com. Transpact is Europe's leading escrow service, which may or may not help everybody, because not everybody knows what escrow means. Escrow is another name for a conditional payment, and it takes place in three simple steps. First step are the two parties involved, the payer and the payee, agree the escrow conditions, which will later determine whether the conditional payment goes on to the payee, back to the payer. Once that's agreed, the payer pays the money to the escrow firm. The escrow firm then holds the money conditionally, depending on future events, and based on those future events, solely on the escrow conditions which were pre-agreed, the escrow company then pays the money either onto the payee or back to the payer. Escrow is used in all sorts of situations, buyer and sellers, deposits, other situations. And it's a great way for online markets to transact. In fact, it's an essential way for online marketplaces to transact, because escrow is the only method that protects both the buyer and the seller simultaneously. Using any other payment method, except maybe insurance, which is expensive, either the buyer or the seller will take a risk in transacting. But with escrow, both the buyer and the seller are fully protected. And so most online marketplaces will engage and use escrow to eliminate fraud and to provide a guarantee to their buyer that they will get everything they were promised or their money back, and will provide a guarantee to the seller that they will get paid 100% as due, with no bad debt and certainty of payment, if they do what they say they promised to do. Even before we started in 2009, escrow had been a significant source of money laundering. Escrow is just another form of money remittance. It takes a payment from A and either pays it on to B or back to A. Obviously, if the payment goes back to A, to the same bank account it was paid from, nothing's been achieved. But if the payment goes on to B, then that's money remittance and a pure vector for money laundering and terrorist financing. In fact, in 2010, the assassination of a Hamas official in Dubai under a terrorist act was found to be funded through payment through an online marketplace using escrow. So over the years, we made representations to both HMRC, who's responsible for money laundering amongst payment remitters, and to the FCA, who are equally responsible, because the demarcation between HMRC and the FCA over anti-money laundering responsibilities isn't so clear in this area. We explained that there were millions, quite possibly billions of pounds every year being money laundered through escrow services. And because it was completely off the radar, nobody was picking up on it. Hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. Then it was going on undocumented, and it was never going to be picked up. Fortunately, possibly, in 2017, Parliament got involved and passed the Payment Services Regulations 2017. And these new regulations specifically dealt with online marketplaces and payment remittance. and except in a very, very rare set of circumstances in the law called the commercial agent exclusion, which doesn't apply to the vast majority of online marketplaces. From the beginning of 2018, under the new law brought in by the Payment Services Regulations 2017, all online marketplaces that receive client money from the payer and then paid it on to the payee had to become registered with the FCA as money remitters. Strangely enough, that didn't actually deal with the money laundering question, but for the FCA to register somebody as a payment service provider, as a money remitter, the FCA will only do that if they've been first registered with HMRC as a money service business, as a money remitter, to ensure that they're fully carrying out all the counter-terrorist financing checks and anti-money laundering checks that need to be carried out. We thought it was going to be great. There was going to be a revolution in the UK to cut down on money laundering, which was taking place on a huge scale through online marketplaces, and to a lesser extent remove the threat of terrorist financing. But what actually happened was the FCA basically went the other way and decided not to, as we understand it, implement the legislation in place. The legislation actually puts a legal mandate on the FCA to ensure that the payment services regulations are not being broken, and forces the FCA to have proper systems and regulations and processes in place to ensure that online marketplaces who are receiving money from a buyer and remitting that money to a seller performs the proper checks and becomes registered with the FCA. But the FCA's attitude was, unless somebody tells us about a particular online marketplace, we're not going to investigate. And virtually to this day, we're now coming towards the end of 2021. As I understand it, virtually no online marketplaces are FCA registered. There is one big exception. eBay became a payment service provider. Previously, eBay didn't touch payment. They left that to an agreement it had with PayPal. eBay and PayPal were forced to split by competition authorities. And even after that, for a number of years, eBay did not conduct or deal with payment. Recently, eBay's actually competed with PayPal and starts handling payment itself. And eBay is online marketplace, which is FCA registered. But the vast majority of other UK businesses which are receiving payment from buyers, not taking ownership of that payment, holding it as client money, not doing any necessary anti-money laundering checks because they're not FCA registered, and then passing that money on to the sellers is very large. The FCA carried out an investigation before the payment services regulations, in the time between the payment services regulations were passed in 2017 and the year later when the payment services regulations were due to come into force, to find out how many online marketplaces would fall under the new law, and they would have to regulate as money remitters, quite rightly, under the new legislation. And the answer was hundreds. That information, after a bit of a struggle, was disclosed to us as part of our judicial review against the FCA, which I'll come on to. Virtually none of those firms that the FCA is aware of and has documented has it taken any steps to force them to register, even though its own study has shown that under the law that came into force, the FCA is mandated to register those firms as money remitters, and it's mandated to put processes into place to prevent those firms from handling payment if they're not registered with the FCA. It's basically just look the other way. So going back in timeline, we're at the beginning of 2018. The new law has actually come into force. We looked to see what was happening with online marketplaces, and the answer was nothing. The online marketplaces were still continuing to transact payment without being FCA registered. So we reported a couple to the FCA. The FCA has a website where it's possible to report firms who are transacting illegally, possibly. And that's what we couldn't do that as a firm. So as the CEO, I took personal responsibility, and in my personal capacity, I reported these firms, and nothing happened. And the FCA's response, quite properly, in fact, is that the FCA can't discuss individual firms with an individual complainant. It's forbidden from doing so by the Financial Services Marketing Act, which is fair enough. But these are blatant cases of firms breaking the law, transacting payment against the payment services regulations when they have to be registered with the FCA, and they're not registered with the FCA. And because they're not registered with the FCA, they're not carrying out any of the necessary anti-money laundering checks, and these transactions are going through. Nobody's checking if there's a genuine transaction and it's just not a payment from a money launderer to somebody they want to launder the money to. Maybe they're paying £20,000 for an apartment holiday rental. Maybe that there's a card transaction going on. There's billions of pounds in the UK transacted through cow semen, believe it or not, through online marketplaces. Maybe some of those transactions are money launderers. Nobody knows, because these transactions, which are meant to be FCA registered, and therefore the firms handling those payments are meant to perform necessary checks, aren't FCA registered, and so they're not performing the necessary checks. The payments themselves still go through the banking system, because the online marketplaces need bank accounts, but the banks themselves only see payments in and payments out by the online marketplace. The banks are not set up to monitor these transactions for money laundering purposes or terrorist financing purposes. It's the online marketplaces who need to be FCA registered and performing the checks with the online marketplaces customers to identify who's actually moving the money, and is there a real underlying transaction, and to perform risk-sensitive and risk-relative checks. And that's what's missing, and has been missing since 2018.
Thank you, Andrew. If we can move on to the next question, could you please briefly describe the interactions you've personally had with the FCA?
So in, I think it was March or April of 2018, we wrote a pre-action letter to the FCA stating that the FCA has a duty under Regulation 108 of the Payment Services Regulations to prevent online marketplaces remitting money without being FCA registered, and the FCA was allowing these activities to continue and wasn't registering firms. The response we got was a bit of a dismissal, didn't really answer the question. And so our firm took a judicial review out against the FCA, asking the courts to examine what our claim that the FCA was in breach of the law. It was failing to meet its legal mandate to put processes into place to prevent firms remitting money when they weren't registered with the FCA. And that whole judicial review process then kicked in. We engaged formally with the FCA's legal department, and matters took their own legal course over the next year and a half, while the judicial review process ground through its various wheels and processes and stages.
Thank you. And can you go on to tell us about what happened in relation to the judicial review?
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, we lost. The judicial review process is very heavily biased for the government to prove that every case is different, and it's not right to generalize. I can only talk about our case, but we believe we had an exceptionally good case. The wording of the law is that the particular law is that the FCA has to have processes in place to basically prevent unregistered firms transacting and making payments. And the way that sort of legislation could have been interpreted by the courts, it's possible that many judges would have been not only sympathetic, but downright indignant with what the FCA is doing. The particular judge that presided over our case decided that the FCA had a process, it had a website, had a form where people could report firms trading and firms conducting payments when they weren't registered, and that was all the law demanded. And that even if the FCA was proven through their own study of knowing there were hundreds of firms who should have been registered, and even though it was proven that only I think it was less than a handful, it was less than 5, if my memory serves me correctly, firms had actually registered with the FCA. So there was a gap of hundreds of firms. And even though firms had been reported for handling for money remittance when they weren't registered, the judge said just by having the form where people could report the FCA, even if the FCA did nothing, that was good enough. That's how the law works in England. It depends on the individual judge, and that was his ruling.
And the next question, please, Andrew. In broad terms, what have your dealings with the FCA been like?
Well, because we were going through a legal process, it was all very formal. We had some face-to-face meetings with legal teams. The FCA were pleasant. They certainly listened. They were forced to listen because they were fighting a judicial review, and they had to put the best case they could forward for what should have been an indefensible position. But they know that the courts are rather deferential, or can be. Some courts can be, some courts can't be. Some courts can be deferential to the executive and to the government, which includes the FCA, for whatever reason. And they were hoping that would transpire in this case. So they were polite. They were. We had discussions, and the courts were deferential to the FCA, and in the end, we got nowhere.
Have you experienced situations where interacting with the FCA has been helpful to either yourself or others? If so, please explain what made the interactions helpful.
I'm racking my brains to try and think of a time when the FCA have actually been helpful. Our firm conducts activities which are very borderline regulatory. Well, when we first started business in 2009, we went to the FCA and said we're going to be receiving millions of pounds from payers and remitting those to recipients. Please with your regulators. And the FCA, it was the FSA in those days. The FSA said, buzz off. We don't want to have anything to do with you. We said, we need to be regulated. It's impossible that we can be doing what we're going to be doing. You're not going to regulate us. I said, no, we don't. You don't fall under Financial Services Marketing Act. Go and do it in a completely unregulated way, and we don't want to have anything to do with you. It was only when the Payment Services Directive was brought in by the EU in 2009 and brought into law as the Payment Services Regulations 2009, which was a few months after we started. We never actually started because we weren't going to trade unregulated. There was no point. We went back to the FCA and said, under the Payment Services Regulations 2009, you've got to regulate us. The law is clear. We then had a year's dispute with the FCA, them saying, no, we still don't have to regulate you, because the FCA really don't want to get involved in what we're doing. They believe that the payment streams that we're handling, the millions and millions of pounds or billions of pounds across the whole escrow sector in various forms, isn't their responsibility. So we had a battle. After a lot of fighting, we actually got them to admit that yes, we do need to be regulated. Of course we do, and we've been operating on that basis ever since. So when you ask, have you ever had any positive interactions with the FCA? Everything that we do is still very up in the clouds. It's all we've asked for help and clarification. We've never got it. I can't remember ever having an official positive interaction with the FCA. We haven't had any negative interactions with the FCA either, except maybe the loss of the judicial review. But I can't think of any positive outcomes, so no, sorry.
Thank you. What are your thoughts, Andrew, on whether the FCA lacks the powers that it needs, or conversely, that it doesn't make good use of the powers it already has?
Probably I've already answered the question. The FCA doesn't only have powers, it is legally forced and mandated to use those powers, but it chooses not to. It makes a very definite internal choice that we're going to ignore the law, we're going to ignore our mandate. We have the powers, and we're going to see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. It doesn't happen, and therefore we can, because we don't want to regulate it, we're not going to regulate it. As a result, there are millions and possibly billions of pounds being laundered through the UK every year through escrow schemes and online marketplaces, and possibly tourist financed as well.
Have you experienced the FCA being reluctant to give clear answers to questions? I'm
just going to move into the light because the sun's moving. It was difficult to get disclosure as part of our judicial review. The FCA was very reticent to provide information and data. We had to drag it out of the FCA, but because of disclosure laws and under judicial review, we were able to get a lot of information out eventually, but it wasn't easy.
Thank you. What is your perception of the culture of the FCA, and what do you think of it?
It's like the curate's egg. It does a lot of good, does a lot of really important work. Broadly, it keeps things in line, but there's a lot of bad as well. There's a lot of, as in our case, looking the other way, putting the FCA first, using our example, the example of the judicial review and the whole escrow sector as a paradigm. When the FCA decides that it's not its responsibility, even when it legally is its responsibility, or it should be its responsibility, then there's just a culture in the FCA of shutting down, of blanking. So, as in our case, even today, all these online marketplaces are continuing to remit payment unhindered and unregistered. We've seen with pension advice for minors, the FCA is interested now. At the time, it wasn't interested. We've seen that again, and you see it with borderline adverts for wine and land banking and all sorts of stuff. The FCA should be getting involved to protect vulnerable investors, or the people who aren't investors, who are persuaded to invest, but just because they're vulnerable people. In those places, the FCA says it doesn't have the powers to intervene, and it's a case for Parliament. If I was the FCA, I would be lobbying left, right, and centre to ensure that the FCA had enough powers. If it doesn't feel it has enough powers, it may well be that it has enough powers, it's just not exercising them, or it could be that Parliament needs to open up in some areas. So broadly, in answer to your question, there are some areas where the FCA not only has the power, it has the mandate, and it ignores them. There are some other areas where the FCA could do with more power, obviously in a proportional and necessary and structured way, not too much about where Parliament needs to give it that power. The biggest red flag flashing at the moment for all of us, possibly, well, there are various red flags. One of the biggest red flags at the moment is the online safety bill and having financial ads included. I mean, that's just such a no-brainer, but there are various other red flags flashing also.
Thank you, Andrew. Have you ever complained officially about the FCA? If so, to whom?
I don't know if you can call our judicial review a complaint. In some ways it was. Separately, we were forced to make a complaint to the FCA Complaints Ombudsman. I can't remember their exact title, because when we started the service in 2009 under the Payment Services Regulations, we were initially only a small payment institution, a regulated firm, and for the first 2 years, because we were arguing with the FCA, and we only became a fully authorized firm, a payment institution, in 2011. Because of that, the FCA online register showed us as two firms. One firm, 2009 to 2011, which was no longer operating, and then our firm from 2011 onwards. Now, we were only ever one firm. It was never on the FCA online register. That caused a huge amount of confusion. The FCA online register is critical because our customers need to know that we're genuine. There's a huge amount of fraud, and we're constantly being impersonated. And there are made-up escrow firms constantly appearing, trying to steal people's money. So it's critical. We tell everybody who uses us to first independently go to the FCA online register and check that we are registered. You'll see on the FCA online register it says transpac.com. Go to the secure transpac.com website, no other, and then you know you're safe. People went to the FCA online register and they saw two entries. One said no longer authorized, and it became very unclear. Were we FCA authorized? Had we been struck off? The whole register just was it wasn't functioning well. We complained to the FCA, they dismissed our complaint. So we complained to the FCA Ombudsman, who held in our favor. So the FCA dismissal of our complaint was wrong. The FCA online register was dysfunctional and wasn't doing the job. It wasn't fit for purpose. It took the FCA quite a while, a year and almost 2 years, to change the FCA online register. And even today, for what they changed it to, it's a bit of an improvement, but it's not a lot better, and it's still not particularly clear. So that's the one time we have made an official complaint against the FCA, and it was held in our favour.
Thank you, Andrew. Next question. Do you believe there should be spot checks by the FCA on regulated and or unregulated entities, perhaps similar spot checks by VAT inspectors?
I'm taking a while to think how to answer the question, because it's a question of resources. As our case shows, spot checks are critical. You've got billions every year being laundered through the UK, through the escrow services of online marketplaces. And because there are no spot checks, these are never going to be found. And you would think that after a few years, somebody would report something and it would stop. The proof of the pudding's in the eating, and recent history has shown that just doesn't take place. Once the FCA don't investigate, they don't investigate, and the criminality or the misdeeds just continue for years and years. It's only when it becomes a public scandal that the FCA seem to get involved. So absolutely, I believe that spot checks need to be conducted, but it's really difficult because that would be very expensive for the FCA, and it's going to be really difficult to fund how to perform those spot checks in a well-functioning manner where they actually make a difference. So absolutely, but it needs an awful lot of thought how to do so in an efficient and cost-productive manner.
Thank you, Andrew. The final question here, are there any other comments that you would like to make?
No. I think I've said everything. So.
Very good. In which case, Andrew, may I thank you again for taking time to provide your evidence to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.